Greetings and welcome back for another Music Theory Bite. In this video, I'm going to be talking about how to sing and understand synthetic scales. If that sounds like something you'd like to learn more about, then stick around and watch this video. So synthetic scales. These are scales that are based off of tonal models. They're based off of major or minor scales with some alterations. It's kind of a catch-all category for tonally based scales with alterations, as we have some that we use frequently enough that we assign names to them, such as the church modes, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and all those. There are some others that we use fairly frequently that have other names, such as the overtone scale. A lot of them have ethnic names to them, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But if you were to do the math and think about how many possibilities there are if you were to take basic major minor scales and alter them in some way, you'd end up with hundreds of scales, over 1,000 scales in fact. So even if we were to throw out all the ones that are rarely or never used, we'd still be facing over 100 scales, maybe even possibly 200 scales, that happen enough that they have a name, people use them, but that's far too many for you and I to just memorize and have ready to go off the top of our heads. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to take a look at some of the processes, some of the methods that people use to create or conceptualize these synthetic scales. And based on using these processes, then we can understand far more scales than we could if we were just memorizing them. So let's get started. So synthetic scales are alterations to basic major or minor scales. Composers used these, especially in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century and on through to today, because they are a way of creating something new out of something that's familiar. That is, if we take the basic major or minor scale that everyone's used to hearing, and we just alter it in one or two fairly subtle ways, we can create a whole new universe of possibilities. That is, a scale, if you think of it as the DNA of a piece of music. It's the pitches, it's the relationships that go into how music sounds. By changing those pitches, changing those relationships just a little bit here and there, what we can do is we can create a whole new sonic landscape. We can create something where maybe the dominant chords don't quite sound like dominant chords anymore. And so it's a very appealing type of technique that composers will use to create something new out of something familiar. The basic techniques that we're going to use are, we're going to start with a major or minor scale, and we're either going to leave out pitches, omit pitches, alter pitches, or we're going to add pitches into that basic scale. Then of course we can always combine these techniques together to create another new scale. One of the most important things to keep in mind is that whenever you create a new pitch collection, you bring with you new melodic and harmonic possibilities. And that's really what this is all about. So after you've figured out what the scale is, then you have to figure out what to do with it. And that involves composition, improvisation, just coming up with new ways of exploiting the possibilities that are inherent in that pitch collection. So let's talk about the three techniques. The first technique, of course, is leaving out pitches. And if you've seen my video on singing pentatonic scales, you'll know that I use this technique to derive the major scale, the major pentatonic scale, and the minor pentatonic scale. So if we start with our major scale and our minor scale written out graphically in front of you, you see all the scale degrees and where the half steps are, where the pitches are closer together. And you'll notice in the minor scale I include both the lowered and raised forms of scale degree 6 and scale degree 7. Oftentimes these things are derived off the natural form of the minor scale, and then we treat the raised 6 and raised 7 as chromatic alterations from that. But just for the sake of ease of explaining it, I'm going to leave those in there for now. So if we were to take our major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, and leave out scale degrees 4 and 7, what we end up with is our major pentatonic scale. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 1. It's simply a major scale in which we've left out 2 scale degrees. And we did the same thing with our natural minor scale. We left out scale degrees 2 and 6, the lowered 6th scale degree, to create our minor pentatonic scale. But we don't just have to leave out scale degrees that get us to pentatonic scales. We can leave out any scale degrees that we want. And if we start messing around with leaving out different scale degrees, we're going to end up with different pitch collections, different scales that we can exploit. So a very simple one is if I take my major scale and I leave out scale degree 4, and instead of scale degree 7, which would get me a major pentatonic scale, I left out scale degree 6 instead, I would end up with a pitch collection that gives me all the scale degrees that I find in the tonic function and all the scale degrees that I find in the dominant function, but almost nothing that I could use to express predominant function. So there are possibilities compositionally and improvisationally that I can use this type of scale for, and it would sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 1. Perhaps the more commonly used technique when we're talking about synthetic scales is to alter pitches. So you'll notice that I've changed my scale chart now to show the total chromatic span. That is, I have my diatonic pitches, and I also have the chromatic alterations, the possible chromatic alterations listed for each of the scales. So when I start to think about using scales and altering pitches to create a new scale, I can also think about this in terms of how I derived my church modes, my ecclesiastic modes. So if you haven't seen that video, that's one you should go back to. I typically think of those scales as being major or minor scales in which I've altered one or more scale degrees. So for example, if I were to take the 6th scale degree from the minor mode and raise it, I would end up with the Dorian mode. The Phrygian mode is a minor scale with the lowered 2nd scale degree. The Lydian scale is a major scale with the raised 4th scale degree. The Mixolydian scale is a major scale with a lowered 7th scale degree. And the Locrian scale is a minor scale with a lowered 2nd and lowered 5th scale degree. So just by altering one, and in one case 2 scale degrees, I end up with a church mode, a scale structure that was used fairly frequently back in history. I don't just have to alter those scale degrees and end up with my church modes. What I can do is I can combine different types of alterations. So for example, a fairly common scale is if we take the 2 major sounding modes and we combine their characteristics together. So I take a major scale and I raise scale degree 4 and I lower scale degree 7. That is the Lydian sharp 4 and the Mixolydian flat 7. I end up with what's called the overtone scale, or sometimes also called the Lydian Mixolydian scale. And it sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. I could also take a minor scale and use the Phrygian flat 2 and the Dorian raised 6 and create a new scale structure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. I might call this the Phrygian Dorian scale. I might even have another name for it. There are all sorts of possibilities of what we can do. We can combine all sorts of alterations. So I could also take my major scale, lower the 2nd scale degree, keep my raised 4th scale degree from Lydian and my lowered 7th scale degree from Mixolydian, and end up with a new scale structure. Now typically when I'm singing something like this, when I create augmented seconds between scale degrees, I want to find those diatonic scale degrees that haven't moved first. So if I had to sing this one, I'd probably start by singing the major triad, 1, 3, 5, and I'm going to hold on to that 3 as I sing the scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. A lovely sound, lots of possibilities of what we can do in there. I could also do something similar with my minor scale, in which I have my lowered 2nd scale degree. I add in the Lydian raised 4th scale degree in minor, and then I'm going to keep my Dorian raised 6th scale degree. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. Again, it's just an alteration of a major or minor scale. The third technique that we can use to create a synthetic scale is to add pitches to the scale. So going back to my original diatonic scale with the possible chromatic alterations, wherever I have one of those chromatic alterations, I have the opportunity to add a pitch into the scale that creates a little bit more chromatic motion. So for example, I can take a major scale and I can add in either the sharp 6 or lowered 7. Those are enharmonic equivalents. Typically we think of this as the flat 7. and it sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. Oftentimes this is presented in its descending form. 1, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, in which it's called a dominant bebop scale. A lot of the bebop scales, jazz-derived scales, will use these added pitches in them in order to create a new sound landscape. So I can also do this with a minor scale. So I might add in my sharp 4 or flat 5 to my minor scale. I'm going to also add in my raised 6 and raised 7, basically making this a chromatic scale from scale degree 4 up to scale degree 1. And the bottom of the scale, I'm just going to have my normal diatonic collection. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6, 6, 7, 1. A lot of possibilities of what you can do with that when you start making chords out of all those available pitches. I always have the possibility of combining these techniques together. So for example, I can start with a major scale and use my raised Lydian sharp 4. I'm going to add in a lowered scale degree 6, and I'm also going to take out scale degree 7. So I'm combining all three techniques in the scale, and it sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6, 1. Very interesting type of sound. So there's all sorts of things that you can do with these. Now you'll notice that I was referring in some instances to names of these scales, and there's really two techniques we have for naming these scales. If you were to go on the internet and look up exotic scales or synthetic scales, you'll find websites with hundreds of scales, each having names that have been assigned to them. The two techniques that we have for naming these scales are very different, and I recommend you use one over the other. That is, the first technique, the preferred method, is what I call a theoretically descriptive type of name. That is, you take the elements, you'll notice I did this when I was singing these scales. I described it as a Lydian sharp 4, or a Mixolydian flat 7, or a Phrygian flat 2. Sometimes the flat 2 is also called a Neapolitan flat 2. Or I take a look at the upper tetrachord and treat it as a harmonic scale, that type of thing. So these descriptions are theoretically descriptive. You could also just very simply describe it using the scale that you use as its base and what alterations are in there. Major scale, sharp 4, added flat 6. Very descriptive. It tells you exactly what is in the scale. Now the other tradition for naming these is what I call the common method, and these oftentimes use ethnic names. So you'll hear people refer to Hungarian scales, Gypsy minor scales, Jewish scales, Arabian scales. These names oftentimes have very little to do with the genesis of the scale or how they're used, and quite frankly, this is the 21st century, we're kind of beyond using ethnic names to describe things anymore. So I don't recommend doing that, although you might hear that and see that out in the professional world. So just keep that in mind, that it's something that's out there, but be the better person and use the theoretically descriptive names instead. Well, that does it for this video. If you found it helpful, please like it. Feel free to leave constructive comments below, and as always, make sure you subscribe to my channel for the latest music theory bites as they become available. Until next time.